welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and I am actually super thrilled to have this interview today that I'm planning. It has to do with a session that I attended at last year's ASECT conference, which, as many of you have known throughout the years at Mormon Sex Info, I try to get a lot of people who I listen to at that event to try to come on and be our interviewees because they have so much information. And last year we were kind of like right at the head of a lot of the Me Too movement and, all these discussions about consent. And I had several people come onto the show and talk about consent, but I went to this presentation by Dayley, and she really kind of blew me away with different ways to think about models of consent, because I was getting a little bit concerned just in our narratives and in our stories of consent that we were becoming so binary in the ways that we were talking about it. And I know that in day-to-day life, and when we're trying to incorporate concepts into lived experiences, typically the more binary something is, the more difficult it is to apply. And so I was getting a little concerned about some of that. And she just really had some good ideas and thoughts about a different type of way of looking at it, which is more of a collaborative consent model. And that's what I want to talk all about today. So I've got both Dayley and her collaborator Fuzzie Connor, and they are going to be talking to, they're both founders of Consent Beyond Yes, which I will make sure to link to. It's consentbeyondyes.com. Emma has a master's in somatic counseling. She from Naropa University, and Fuzzie is a consent educator and entrepreneur, and I'm super excited to have them on the show. So welcome, Emma and Fuzzie.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here with you.
Awesome. So how I'd like to start is by having each of you just take a turn and introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, what you're doing, what you're studying, etc.
Sure. I'm Emma Dayley. I use she or they pronouns. And as Natasha just said, I have a master's in somatic counseling from Naropa University. And that's really where I was when I started working on the bringing embodiment aspect of my studies to consent work. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. But I currently live in Pennsylvania. I work full-time as a therapist. I do family therapy and individual school-based therapy, in addition to running Consent Beyond Yes and teaching workshops with Fuzzie.
Awesome.
And Fuzzie Connor, and I'm an educator of various topics. For the last 15 years, I've been teaching about consent and co-ops, alternative economic systems, alternative currencies, contact improvisation, and other topics. And I am also a co-op consultant. I help people start co-ops, and I am a community organizer running an alternative currency in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And yeah, I met Emma when I was exploring consent and trying to find consent education materials that seemed to me, what I found when I went looking for consent education was that the stuff out there was mostly inconsistent and unrealistic. It was saying that all consent has to be verbal, or that if you don't get a no, then it's fine, right? Which is not good enough, and various other problems. And I started creating my own consent model that I thought would be better suited to the reality of relationships. And I met Emma in that process, and we decided to collaborate.
Yeah, and at that time, I had recently been to a consent workshop. I was living in a housing co-op, and one of the other co-ops in the community hosted a consent workshop for Valentine's Day. So I went to that and really liked it, but also thought it was kind of lacking in depth. So I had already started working on how to bring some of the somatic aspects from my study to consent, and how we could make the practice of consent and knowing our own desires and our boundaries, how we can make that a more embodied process, and not just have it be an intellectual one, but really something that's grounded in the wisdom of our bodies as well as our minds and hearts.
Can you talk a little bit about the word somatic? Some people may not fully understand what that implies and how that informs the way you're looking at things.
Absolutely. Somatic just means body-based. It comes from the Greek soma. So my degree is in mental health counseling, but without the idea that the body and mind are separate from each other. So I really work with people's entire systems. So again, it's not discarding the mind, but really getting into the felt sense and the embodied wisdom and evolutionary wisdom, really, that our bodies have.
I love that. Yeah. So the whole premise kind of started in your presentation with the models that seem to currently exist, or that seem to be the way most people kind of conceptualize consent. And you talked about three of them, and I was hoping that we could just kind of start with understanding these three kind of existing models that you're trying to expand upon, and both kind of like limits and benefits and limits to those. And you had said that there's an ambiguous consent model, there's a negative consent model, and there's an affirmative sex model. So what can the both of you say about these three?
Yeah, well, before consent was really a popular term, we call that model ambiguous consent, which, also known as no means try harder, which is, where you don't really know if someone is meaning what they say when they say yes or no. And it just invites miscommunication.
And one of the reasons that, and again, it's a little confusing to call it a model of consent because it wasn't being talked about as consent, but I think a lot of us still grow up with this, and it's certainly throughout our popular culture materials that it's often very gendered as well, where the woman is the gatekeeper and the man is supposed to try to get as much as he can. And
people socialized as men generally are taught to just go for what you want and don't take no for an answer, right? And people socialized as women are often taught to always say yes and to please other people.
Take care of other people before yourself.
Or if you're raised as a Mormon woman, you're raised with take care of other people, but not sexually until you get to a certain point. But then maybe not. It's like a lot of and even as you're talking about the media, I mean, I remember the black and white movies, right? Where he would grab her and then she would slap him across the face.
Yep.
And then they would look at each other and he would forcibly kiss her and she would resist for a little while and then melt into his arms. Yeah. I'm like, what the heck kind of education is that on consent, right?
Right, but that's exactly what we're talking about, where it's this very mixed message. And, it either, you're met initially with a no, but then if you keep trying, she'll realize she really wants it. Or, and the reason I call it ambiguous consent is because sometimes, and especially, I mean, you brought up a great point, if you're raised not only as a woman, but as a woman in Mormonism, where maybe you're not supposed to want sex. Right? If your desire has been shamed or shut down or just not acknowledged in some way, then you might have this message that I'm supposed to not want this, but in the meantime, on a body level, you actually do want it, right? Sometimes women have learned to turn down sexual advances, but they actually still have a desire for it. So that's kind of the upside of ambiguous consent, is it allows us to use multiple channels of communication. We can say no with our words and kind of preserve our reputation in that way, but then we can still communicate the authentic yes with our bodies. And when that's actually what you're doing, it can work pretty well. But as Fuzzie said, it invites a lot of miscommunication, and it has trained people, especially men, but I think women and people of other genders have also internalized this, where it creates situations where you say no and then the no isn't believed.
Right.
So that gives rise then to that next model that you call negative consent, where the tagline is no means no. And that emerged, I guess, a few decades ago at this point, where it's saying, none of this ambiguous stuff. If you hear a no, you believe it. It's a no. That has to be respected.
So that was an important next step, trusting when someone says no, they really mean it. And on the other hand, it's not enough. No means no was never enough, right? Because not everyone has the same ability to say no. Some people, because of a history of oppression or trauma or socialization of various kinds, have a really hard time saying no, even when they're really not into what's happening. Again, like women are often taught to say yes all the time and please other people, and so it might be really especially hard for them to say no. And if someone is just not saying no, right, if they're not also saying yes, they still might not be enjoying what's happening. They might be a no to it and just not be able to say it.
Right. And in the moment, that could be because of socialization, like Fuzzie is talking about. It could also be because of an active trauma response in the moment, where somebody goes into a freeze response or a fawn response where they're just trying to please the person, or a compliance response would be another way to say that. Then that ability to say no and to assert a boundary is going to disappear. And so if all you're waiting for is a no and just assuming everything is okay unless you get a no, you can get into some really dangerous territory.
And you had another point on your slide too, that was like the interaction is really kind of framed by the initiator. So it's mostly kind of going off what the initiator is presenting instead of really including both partners when you're in a no model.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's one of the other reasons that we think it doesn't go far enough, right? It's not just problematic because not everybody has equal access to a no, but also desire isn't anywhere in that model of consent. Right? It's kind of implicit in the initiator. And so the initiator has a desire, they act on it. And as long as they don't get a no, they keep going. But we have no idea how the other person feels about it. We're assuming that they're not a strong enough no to say anything, but that might not be true. And hopefully it's not what we're going for, right? The standard question for consent is this okay? But I mean, first of all, you should know if something's okay before you start it as a baseline. But also if all you're asking is this okay, then you're going to end up having okay sex.
I love that.
And if you're focused on your no line, right, what you're a no to, what you're afraid of, what your boundaries are, right, that just orients you towards a fear response. And that's not a great place for intimacy and connection and great sex, right? If all you're thinking about is what you don't want and what you're afraid of, and you're worried about getting too close to that line and having to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Right. It creates a lot of fear where lots of people these days are either afraid that their boundary is going to be violated or that they're going to be accused of violating somebody's consent. And that's especially true when all we're teaching people is just to get over that line of it being okay. Right? We're now on ethical territory, but if your goal is just to get over that line, you could be riding right up against it. The line might move around. You don't always know where it is. So again, it can be a dangerous place. It's not good for relationships.
And unfortunately, a lot of consent education these days contributes to fear of sex. It makes people, right, like people are either afraid of being assaulted or afraid of being accused of assault. And right, and it's based on this idea that there's a binary of between consent and assault, or consent and rape, and you just, right, that's a very fine line, and you got to be really careful not to accidentally slip over it, and
right.
That causes all kinds of problems. Again, it makes us focused on what we don't want, on our boundaries and fear. It like if you're shooting for just shy of that line, you're probably, maybe you're still in ethical territory, but you're probably not having a great time. Or the other person's not having a great time. Maybe nobody's having a great time.
Right. Right. Yikes. Yeah. And you had a picture on the slide, right, where it was like consent and non-consent. It was the binary approach. There was just a line in the middle. It was either green or red. There was no yellow, right? There was just the green or red. But before we go there, tell me a little bit about the affirmative consent model. So we went from ambiguous consent to no means no, to then kind of this, well, you have to have an enthusiastic yes, or yes is yes. So that was the next step in kind of the consent narrative discussion.
Yeah, it's usually said as yes means yes, or only yes means yes, right? Unless you actually hear a yes. Sometimes they say a verbal yes to an activity, then you shouldn't do it at all. And so that's an acknowledgement of the difficulty that some people have in saying no. So it's a big step forward, and it's part of the journey that we're helping to guide people on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It helps to orient more towards desire and pleasure right? What you want instead of what you don't want. And reduces the risk of crossing a boundary or triggering a trauma response.
So what would be wrong with it? Why would it have some problems or limitations?
Can I add one thing before we?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Just from the somatic perspective, often in our workshops, we have people imagine something that they don't want and imagine something that they do want, and just sort of scan their bodies for what's happening that tells them that it's pleasant or unpleasant. And very often with things that we don't want, there's a sense in the body of tensing up, maybe trying to protect or close off or turn or move away from the thing. And with the things we do want, there's often an opening, a moving toward, maybe a softening. There could be sort of a tensing in a sense of preparing the muscles to approach what you want, but it's a different kind of tensing than a protective armoring tensing. So we encourage people to use that information just to guide them to figure out what they want and what they don't want. But also, the more open, relaxed states are much more conducive to the flow of pleasure and to enjoyment. Whereas if you're really tense, if you're afraid, if you're protecting yourself, it's really hard to enjoy yourself in that state. So that's another reason that, even in the no means no model, even if you are in ethical territory, just that orientation toward, are my boundaries going to get crossed, can create body states that make it hard to experience pleasure. Whereas orienting more toward your pleasure and toward your desires creates more open body states that allow sensation to flow and that actually allow you to experience the pleasure that you might be getting from those activities.
Yeah, I love that. I always tell people that your vagina and your penis don't typically know much about the relationship that you're in with another person. They just know if they're tense or not. And they're going to not be happy if they're tense, right? They're not going to be having the arousal and desire responses that you'd want out of a good sexual encounter. So that falls right in line with all of that about being aware of your body. So let's move towards what are the limitations of this. If most people would be like, yes means yes, that's great, that's a great model, let's stick with that.
It's a big step forward. It still has some problems. First of all, it's got an overemphasis often on verbal communication, and a lot of people feel like constantly asking, oh, is this okay? Oh, can I kiss you? Can I touch your face? Can I touch your shoulder? Can I touch your breast? Right? It's like, it's hard to kind of be in a flow state or, have a sexy interaction when you're constantly checking for consent. And in practice, a lot of people therefore just don't use that model, right? Even if that's what they're taught is the right way to do it, they're like, no way, that's I'm not going to do that. Another problem is still, it's framed by the initiator, right? As when you ask a yes or no question or make a request of something specific, the other person might say, yeah, sure, right? And maybe they actually are a yes to it, but it's probably not the thing that they would have come up with, if you just ask them, what do you want?
Right, and it also still preserves that binary yes, no, rape, assault idea, where, well, if you didn't get a yes and you did it anyway, then you just committed sexual assault. And so it still ends up creating some fear of screwing up. And even though it's more likely to help you find things that people are enthusiastic about, there's still this binary line that doesn't provide you with any kind of buffer or really room for a whole lot of communication necessarily. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if you do it well, you're going to be communicating a lot. And like Fuzzie said, we think that it's important for there to be room for nonverbal communication. And some affirmative consent models do allow for that. And I think that's been increasingly the case over the past few years. If you look at like college consent policies and so forth, usually it'll just say clear communication. Sometimes it says verbal or nonverbal. So there is more acknowledgement, and that comes out of research as well about sexual communication, that people use and believe it's very valid to use nonverbal communication. So I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah, so much of our communication in general is nonverbal, our facial expressions, our movements, whether I come in or out. I mean, just lots of ways that we can we could, I mean, I think back when I was in school, they talked about it. I don't know that it can be really measured, but almost like 80% of your communication in any given space or time is, nonverbal. So you think that we have to make room for that in the sexuality realm as well.
Absolutely. And I like to tell people that nonverbal communication is happening whether you're aware of it or not. So I'd much rather have people be aware of it and make use of it and try to have congruency between the nonverbal and the verbal, rather than when we're totally out of touch with our bodies. The body language is still happening, but sometimes we try to override it with our minds, and then we end up sending mixed messages and not actually knowing what we want. And that's a space where it's really easy to end up being compliant as well.
Right.
Which is really a killer to passion and good sex.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that you said that I loved was, how can we use consent as a tool of sexual wellness, not just violence prevention? And I think what you're both saying is so much of our communication and education around consent does have to do with sexual assault. And obviously that's very important. We want to avoid sexual assault. And yet we miss a big part of the conversation, which is pleasure and desire, when that's the main thing we're talking about. So that's what gets us into this collaborative model. So let's start talking about that.
Yes, this is where we started. This is the stuff that we've developed, where we've developed our own theory and our own model over the past 2.5 years.
We call it collaborative consent, or beyond yes and no. So, we're trying to go beyond the binary of yes and no, also beyond the binary of rape and consent, right? And another problem with that binary of rape and consent is that there's a lot of things that kind of fall in a gray area in real life, right? If you think that you have to be in one category or the other, right? You might end up saying, well, I didn't really say no. I guess I was okay with it, but it didn't feel great. But I guess there was nothing wrong with it, right? Because it wasn't rape. But that doesn't feel right, So you're ignoring your feelings, and you're ignoring, and you're not learning from the experience. Or on the other hand, you might say, well, I didn't want that, so I guess it must have been rape. And then you end up causing a lot of problems by either that, like, maybe it was an honest mistake, it was an accident, and maybe if you just could talk to the person about it, you could come to an understanding. But if you think that it has to fit in one category or the other, then you might end up not being able to do that. So,
and I'm guessing you get pushback on this, right? Like, because a lot of people are, oh, well, then you're just denying certain experiences. And yet these things that you're saying, I hear in my office all the time, this kind of ambiguous post experience analysis, right? Where it's like, what happened? What did I want? That's an ambiguous thing a lot of times, just from an individual perspective, where people don't always know what they want, especially if they're younger, especially if they're dating, especially if they're single and coming, like I'm saying, from a religious culture where they're not really taught to want, or they're not supposed to want, but like you said earlier, their body may want things. It can also happen in some of the kind of duty sex scenarios I see within marriages, where it's like, well, it's my duty, especially from, again, the female-bodied experience, where that's what I'm supposed to do as a wife. I'm supposed to take care of his needs. Otherwise, I'm not being a good wife, or he may, the myths of that means that he might go elsewhere, or all of those fears and things. And so a lot of times the individual doesn't even know necessarily what they want. And yet at the same time, there are experiences where people will tell me things like, well, I said no like 10 times. I finally, it just happened. He kept pushing. I don't know what, and I'm feeling like, well, you're getting pretty close to where I would consider that a date rape or something along those lines, but they're not able to really own that because they do care about the person, or they had they felt responsible, like, because they were in that situation. So this is a complicated area, right? Where sometimes people under report, sometimes people over report or over analyze. How do you
Yeah, well, we try to embrace the complication and the nuance and the gray area and just say, it's not black and white. It's not red or green, right? Like there's a spectrum from rape to consent. And
the far end of that consent spectrum being really good sex.
Yeah, furthermore, we think that spectrum is the same as the spectrum of bad sex to good sex, basically, right? That they overlap. So if you are just over the line, that it's like in that gray area, it's probably ethical, but it's probably not great sex, right? Nobody's having a great time in that scenario. And if you're having great sex, you're nowhere near the line of sexual assault, right? Because
as long as it's great for everybody involved.
Right.
Right. Right.
Well, and one of the things we do when we start, right, because part of our approach is using consent to make sex sexier, and so one of the things we do is we start by talking about what are some things that make sex sexy, and people say connection and trust and enthusiasm and generally all of these things, all of the things that make sex sexy involve everyone involved wanting what's happening, and so we try to get people to see that when we think about great sex, right, it's not just the act that we're imagining, it's also the other person wanting it too. But we might think that we want a kiss or a hug or a sex act, but really we want the other person to want it too. What we really want is a mutually desired interaction.
Reciprocity is a big part of what makes something sexy.
Mm.
And on that line of, people do underreport, and it can be really hard to call rape, especially when you know the person and you care about the person, which is so often the case with rape, right? It's hardly ever the stranger leaping out from the bushes. It's usually somebody that we know. And it often comes from these scenarios of, well, I said yes to a certain level of intimacy, and then we reached my boundary, and then the other person crossed it. And that can make it really hard to call it rape, because we feel partially responsible for getting into the situation in the first place, or not saying no strongly enough. And there's all kinds of victim blaming messages around that. And we don't ever want to victim blame, and we don't want to deny people the experiences that they're having. Like when it is clear, you should absolutely call it what it is and take the steps that you need to. And so we're not trying to take clear experiences and make them ambiguous. We're trying to make space for the ambiguous experiences that people have all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important clarification, because I can already hear, like a lot of the pushback, that makes these conversations sometimes very heated, very binary, and that's what keeps them binary. And then we're not necessarily in solution focused land, right? So
exactly.
The more we can make room for conversation and
my own head, where I don't want to make it harder for people to name it when they've been raped or things like that. I don't want to give people who have truly committed assault a language to excuse their behavior, but I do want to create space for learning conversations to happen and for growth to happen where that's available.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's just dive right into then the components of what makes the collaborative model unique to what you've been creating.
Well, first of all, our orientation is toward desire instead of fear, and toward mutual desire, right? So as I said a minute ago, what we really want is mutually desired interactions. And so we draw a very simple little Venn diagram that just has two overlapping circles. And one circle is, these are all the things that person A wants to do in an interaction, and the other circle is all the things that person B wants to do. And then where they overlap, this is the sweet spot, right? The zone of mutual desire, or we sometimes call it the Venn vagina, because
I love it.
And we say, this is where the really juicy, sexy, fun connecting
really sweet
experience really
happening
in the vagina. That's where you want to be, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, so we're aiming for mutuality, and that requires really developing a level, first of all, of awareness of desire, and secondly, of communication with your partner. And it can be vulnerable to say what you really want and to be bold with your requests. And so on the one hand, it's vulnerable and that can be scary, but on the other hand, it's through vulnerability that we create intimacy. So it's also really good for relationships to be able to do this and to establish a feeling of teamwork where together we're trying to create a mutually enjoyable experience. Often with sex, people use the baseball metaphor, right? Like, oh, I got to third base last night, or whatever, I'm going to score tonight. And, so, I mean, not only is it problematic because it implies this linearity of what sex is supposed to look like, but who's the other team? Who are you playing against in that metaphor? It goes back to the gatekeeping model of sex,
and
where
winning and losing.
Right. And then you call them your adversaries with your sexual partner. And we just think that's problematic for relationships. It's problematic for having enjoyable sex. So really working on sex being a collaborative, cooperative effort of creating the most mutual pleasure that you can, and using the communication in that framework. So instead of the communication being like, oh no, I might get rejected, it's giving your partner all the information that you need to be able to say, okay, what is in that overlap? Here's my circle and here's your circle. We have to know what's in each of those in order to figure out what's in that overlapping part of the Venn diagram.
So we teach people how to identify their own desires, as Emma said earlier, noticing the somatic cues of things we want and things we don't want, the body experience, what it feels like in our body. And then we do exercises to communicate desires with other people. We do, we think it's very important to have embodied practice of these things in our workshops and not just talk about it.
Yeah.
And we get people walking around, and we get people to practice saying no and hearing no, right? It's just like you walk around and you ask someone for a hug and they say no, and when someone says no to you, you say thank you. And that's, we're trying to reorient toward thinking of no and boundaries as a gift. No is a gift. It's a gift of clarity and authenticity. It's a gift of information. It's a gift, of helping to redirect toward that sweet spot of mutual desire. It's saying no, you didn't hit the right spot yet.
And with that, it changes how we think about boundaries, right? So instead of boundaries being an obstacle to getting what I want or an obstacle to connecting, think of boundaries as the container that lets us enjoy. Right? So if there are things that are going to get in the way of enjoyment, we set up boundaries to put those things outside of our container. I talk about it like the fence around a playground, and once we figure out where that is, well, great, now we get to explore what's on our playground and what do we want to do together. So instead of seeing the boundaries as threat, again, of an obstacle or a threat of rejection in some way, really looking at boundaries as creating the safety in which we can actually relax and enjoy ourselves.
In a sense, saying no is actually the most connecting and intimate response you can give to a request, because it demonstrates that you're willing to be authentic and transparent, right? And that you trust each other. Saying, if you hear someone say no, you can trust them when they say yes, right? If, like, many people have the experience of someone who always says yes to everything you ask of them, and then you eventually start to doubt whether they really mean it, or like, how do you know which times they really did want the thing and which times they were just saying yes to be nice? So we say thank you when someone says no, because that's a gift of saying, oh, okay, now I can trust it when you say yes. I know you really mean it.
That's a beautiful ritual. I love that, because for so many people, the no has so much meaning behind it, right? It's a meaning of being rejected, of being turned down, of not being desired, of not being wanted. And instead to have this huge reframe it's just completely alters the whole possibility of what you're encouraging people to think about.
Yeah, I found it really powerful in my life to say thank you whenever someone, turns me down for anything. I find it to be a really valuable practice. I find it helps me, not only it helps me be easier to say no to, right? It makes people feel more comfortable saying no to me when I say thank you, right? Because instead of, have you ever like said no to someone and they push back, right? They're like, oh, come on, please. Or they're like, fine, I didn't want to do that anyway. Or like, okay, well, what about next weekend? And they're, or just like, or what about this thing instead? And they keep asking, right? So like, so saying thank you, sometimes I say thank you for saying no, or thank you for taking care of yourself. Thank you for being clear. I find, it helps me be easier to say no to, it helps people trust me more, right? So that they're more likely to say yes to me because they know that I will listen when they say no. And also it helps me reframe in my own head, helps me like remember to think of the no as a gift and to cultivate the gratitude for that in myself.
That's still a lot about yes and no. And when we do workshops, we do like to start with no, because it always brings up this stuff about rejection or caretaking. So it's really important to practice that skill first. Then we let people start to say yes to things if they want. But eventually we do want to move beyond yes and no. That's one of our taglines. And one of the ways that we like to teach people to do that is by using desire-oriented language and using open-ended questions. So the ways that we use our words actually influence a lot the information that we get and even how sexy it feels. So again, we talked about moving away from, is this okay, to, would you like this? But as long as you're in that yes or no question, then it's still the person who is asking the question who's framing it. It's like, I don't know, saying, hey, do you want me to make you a cake for your birthday? And that's a yes or no question. It's a great offer. I'm likely to say yes, but maybe I actually would rather have pie. And you don't know that because you already decided that the offer was cake.
By making a request or an offer, you're kind of framing the interaction. You're kind of putting something on the table, and then that's basically what the other person is responding to, and it might not be what they wanted most.
Right. So we like to teach people to use open-ended questions like, what would feel good to you right now? What would make this even better? How would you like to touch me? Whatever it is, to solicit more information from a partner instead of just saying, are you interested in this one thing? It's saying, tell me all the things you're interested in, or tell me what you want most. Right. And then it's easy for me to check, or it's easier. I mean, not everybody, it's a developed practice to be able to check, but once I have the information, I can check and see, how does that overlap with my desires? Does that sound good to me? And then I can also share what are the things that I want. And then we can start to have the negotiation. And when we talk about this, it's easier to imagine it verbally. And certainly with a new person, it works a lot better verbally. But if two people are very comfortable with nonverbal communication, either they just happen to be, even if they're new to each other, or once people are together a long time and they learn each other's nonverbal communication, this conversation can also happen largely nonverbally, especially if you've done the earlier steps of building the sense of teamwork, trusting that you really have the same goal, trusting each other to be honest with your yes and your no and your desire. That all lays the groundwork to be able to get into more subtle forms of communication. And
do you have any examples of what that might look like, or is that more difficult to describe?
Yeah, well, we do some exercises in our workshop of how, nonverbal communication, and one thing we say about nonverbal communication is that not everyone is really comfortable with using nonverbal communication, especially people on the autism spectrum or other neurodiverse abilities can make it really difficult to pick up on body language and social cues and so on. And
depending on our socialization, our family background, cultural background, we
trauma history,
right? We might pay attention to different cues, or we might over or underemphasize different things. So it is a more ambiguous way of communicating.
And it's very culturally based. It varies a lot between different cultures. Like in some cultures, nodding your head means no, or shaking your head means yes, or so we encourage people to start off early on with a conversation about communication style. And it might start with something like, how do you like to communicate consent, or how will I know if you're having a good time, or do you want verbal check-ins, right? That's just a good way to start that conversation, or start by sharing your own, like I like nonverbal communication. I'm comfortable with body language. but maybe I want a verbal check-in before you touch my genitals or something, right? Like, how about you?
Mm-hmm.
By doing that, it sets the example, because not everybody's
Mm-hmm.
thought about their communication preferences that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it sets the example of the kind of information that you're looking for, just like you might do with an informed consent conversation, saying, here are the things that I've been tested for, here's when I was tested, this is my sexual history, or here's any other partners I have. If we have sex, here's what it's going to mean to me for a relationship. Sharing whatever kind of information you would like from somebody else and setting the example makes it a lot easier for them to respond in kind.
Yeah, I love that. Instead of just right off the bat, so what's your sexual history? You're setting the example by going first. Yes.
Right.
If it's something you want, offer it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then we sort of do a brainstorm of like, what are some nonverbal ways of saying no and yes, and so like common things are like moving away is a sign of no, right? Moving in is a sign of yes. You can shake your head or nod your head. You make happy sounds like right?
Mm-hmm.
Means yes, or like no, right? Or or of course, like if someone starts touching you, you can move into that touch or out of the touch.
Create more closeness.
You can push their hand away or move it somewhere else where you want it, and
add pressure or ask or move it. So it's, or even motion, like you can put your hand on top of somebody else's hand and kind of guide them.
Exactly. My legs are really ticklish and people forget that. So sometimes they're touching me and they think they're being nice and it starts to tickle. So I might just put my hand on and add pressure to remind them.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of that negotiation, again, I think it does depend a lot on trusting that we're in this together, we have the same goal. So any redirection that I do isn't going to be taken personally. It's going to be taken as a gift of, oh, great, we can level up. We can make this even better. So maybe that's like somebody is going down on me and I feel done with that. And it's not because they're doing a bad job. It's just because I'm ready for something else, or my body has maxed out on that type of stimulation, even if they're doing a wonderful job. And so then I might pull them up to kiss me, or I might non-verbally suggest intercourse, and words can come in at any time, but just moving toward the things that we want. And if that person, maybe I tried to move from oral sex to intercourse and my partner doesn't want to have intercourse, and so they start touching me in some other way, or they move my hands to some part of their body, and just kind of going through that process until we find something that we land on and we're both like, yeah, that's the sweet spot. This feels good.
I love that. So going back to your vagina then, or vulva then, either one, I guess. When you showed it on the screen, and maybe you'll be able to share this slide with us, so I can link it to the podcast link. But it came in several colors. So there was like the sweet spot, I think, in the very middle, right? That was green, but then there were like the labia lips per se, right? They were yellow. And then there was like the clitoris and the anus that were orange. So that was like kind of the Venn diagram. So how do you explain what those different colors were bringing up? Because I'm guessing, and I'll let you then talk, but the green is kind of like we're both like enthusiastically yes, but then there's things that like I'm super into that my partner's like, I'm willing, but it's not a no, but it's not my favorite thing. But since you like it a lot, I'm willing to go there every now and then. Or I'm guessing that's where these kinds of different colors come into your Venn.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The simple Venn diagram that we described at first just had one set of overlapping circles. It's just, here's what I want, here's what you want, where do those intersect? But then if you add a second circle around each of those, it's hard to describe verbally. I would be happy for you to share the images and link to those. But if you add a second circle around each of those, of the things that are not wanted, but that you're willing to do, right? They're still within your tolerance, your whatever, in some way, your willingness, you could do that as a gift to your partner, but it's not the thing that really gets you going, then that's that outer circle. So where the inner circle sort of intersects with the outer circle, this is hard to describe verbally, but yes, there's the sweet spot of everybody's enthusiastic, and then there are the things that one person is enthusiastic about and the other person is willing to do. And then where you said there was orange around like the clitoris and the anus, that's things that both people are willing to do but nobody's enthusiastic about. And then beyond that are things that's beyond somebody's boundaries.
Right. So
we're really aiming for that innermost spot for the vagina, in the Venn diagram, to be able to say, okay, this is mutual. This is what we both really want. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we both feel like we're receiving, right? Sometimes it's being in the giving role is what's really wanted. Sometimes what's really wanted is not having to make any decisions, having the other person make all the decisions. Like, those are all valid desires. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's really what you want and what your partner wants are in that inner spot. But then we get this buffer of ethical but not amazing for everybody involved.
Right.
Yeah, and again, if you're shooting for the sweet spot, if you're shooting for the really great connecting intimate sex and you miss a little, you're probably going to land in still ethical territory, just like, okay, we could improve next time, right?
There's still some pleasure, nobody's feeling violated, but yeah, hey, we could do better.
And one of the ways that we try to orient people towards the sweet spot, we have an exercise that we call the Beyond Yes and No exercise, where instead of stating a desire or request as a yes or no, two people partner up and they each take a moment to notice a desire for the interaction. And when you notice your desire, you say ready. And then when both people say ready, you take turns sharing your desires, and then you negotiate to find something that you both want. And we say, don't settle for something you're just okay with. For this exercise, really try to find something that both of you actually want. And boy, it gets really creative. Mm-hmm. Sometimes like one person will say like, I was thinking I'd like to hug you. And the other person is like, oh, I was thinking I'd like to throw you over my shoulder and spin you around. And the first person's like, whoa, that sounds way better. Yeah, do that.
I didn't know I could ask for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Or,
Or someone is like, I'd like to sing a song with you. And the other person's like, I want to hold your hand and jump up and down. And then you have people jumping around the room singing a song.
Right. And it just, yeah, it's an exercise that people find really valuable to help orient toward what I want, what you want, and what we both want together.
That's lovely. I've loved so many of the examples that you've given. I love the open-ended questions. I love the Venn diagram. I love the examples of both verbal and nonverbal cues that we can offer. I loved that you really kind of clarified that wanting isn't necessarily initiating, like people want all kinds of things. And in fact, people sometimes want things that they're concerned about, like, why do I want to be submissive, if I'm a feminist in my normal life, day-to-day life, right? Or why do I want to role play something that I really wouldn't ever want to do in real life, or why do I want whatever those things are. And so I really think that it's useful to consider wanting versus initiating as two very different things, or kind of typical ways that you think about how sex goes as far as what we've been taught.
People are not used to communicating about sex, and maybe they've been taught that you're not supposed to communicate about sex. Like, our culture sometimes teaches some people like, yeah, you're just supposed to know how to have sex. You're not supposed to, it's the best sex is when you've never done it before, the other person's never done it before, you've never had any education or training, you don't talk about it at all, and you're in the dark, right?
I'm like, oh no, and yet that's what most of us come from, especially in Mormon land, right? So I mean, that's
what other skill do we expect people to just know how to do without any training or practice or even talking about it?
Exactly.
And a lot of, oftentimes in traditional heterosexual relationships, you end up with kind of like the man is kind of doing things that he thinks the woman wants, that he thinks he's giving, right? He's like serving her, and she's kind of letting it happen because she thinks it's what he wants. And so nobody's actually getting what they want. Nobody's having a good time.
That's how you end up in that orange zone.
Yeah, it's like
an unnecessary tragedy, right? Because you can see how it's very well intentioned, right. And how many of these dilemmas come from very loving spaces, and yet you're just kind of creating more dilemmas. And then on top of it, you add story and meaning to it. I talk about meaning ruts a lot in my own language. Just we get into these meaning ruts. Our dissatisfaction must mean this, it must mean that. And a lot of times those meanings come back to there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with you. And we've kind of missed the boat, and that's where the unnecessary tragedy comes in.
Yeah.
We're on the same team. All we need to do is talk about it, right? All we need to talk about what we want, and we can work on it together.
And
go ahead. Yes.
Even when things don't go well, and if there is, like, oops, we slipped out of that mutual desire zone, or even, hey, you just crossed a boundary of mine. If it's in the context of a caring relationship, having a conversation about it actually ends up strengthening the relationship. If you're both really able to hold that. Fuzzie and I have had a lot of those conversations, and actually a lot of this material has come out of conversations that Fuzzie and I have had when we didn't get consent quite right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've crossed those boundaries countless times, and we talk about it and we process it, and we say, we say I'm sorry, and like, thank you for telling me, and what can I do to make this better, and we talk about how to improve next time.
Right, because it's really not about the apology, right? Apologies don't change anything, but indicating maybe with an apology that you care, that you're listening, hearing the other person, and really holding back from getting defensive, which is really hard.
Yeah.
But if somebody's feeling like they've been violated in some way, it's so important to just hear them and validate what they're feeling, right? 'Cause their feelings don't mean that what they're saying is the absolute truth about you. It just means they're telling you about the intention or about the impact you had. It doesn't mean that your intentions were bad. But it's really important to give people the space that they need to express themselves and the care they need to feel safe again. And once they're feeling safe, you can check, hey, can I share with you what was going on for me during that? Once they understand that you've really heard the impact you had, then you can ask their consent to share what your intention was. And through that, you can really build a lot more intimacy and more understanding, and you can start to strategize for how to be doing it better together.
I think it's really important to be careful about how we handle boundary crossings. This is a thing that often gets left out of consent education, and when like the typical thing, one of the most common things that happens these days when someone is accused of a consent violation is they get kicked out of their community, or they get cut off. They get rejected and like completely by all of their social connections, and generally that's not going to make the situation better, right? It may protect the victim, but that person who was accused is probably going to go to the next community and do it again, but do it worse because they're more angry now and self-justified, right? The only way we're going to change the culture is if we call those people back into community when they make mistakes. We talk to them, we listen to them, to their perspective, and help them understand, educate them about why what they did was harmful and how to make different choices in the future.
And that's not necessarily the victim's job to do, right? We think that the victim's safety is still the first thing to address.
Absolutely.
And then, sort of taking that person's lead as much as possible, where, they may or may not want to have a conversation with the perpetrator, or a strong language for, we know that many of these are, potentially accidental, etc. Which again doesn't excuse it, but means that there might be room for education and learning, right? That the situations where it's really egregious, where somebody said no 10 times clearly and then the person did it anyway, is a really different situation from, in the moment I wasn't sure what I wanted and then my partner did something that I didn't like, or whatever, like there's a lot of there's a
There's
lot
a
of
spectrum. There's a spectrum.
There's a
Yes. Anywhere along the spectrum, there can be a lot of distress. And yet there is, I think, a spectrum of how we dialogue about these things. And I think that's what you're trying to introduce.
yeah, and some of our friends at the Center for a New Culture like to talk about like how willing is this person to learn, you know, and have that be part of the consideration in terms of keeping them in community. Because again, like Fuzzie said, if we're wanting to change culture, if we're wanting to create new norms of communication, then that has to include people who don't know how to do it yet.
Yeah.
To the extent that we can do so safely.
Yeah, we encourage people to be gentle with themselves as they're learning these skills and to be gentle with others as much as possible.
So tell me about consentbeyondyes.com. What are you doing? What are you trying? Is this a movement? Is this trainings? What are you offering? This is where you get to plug whatever the heck you want to plug in regards to your efforts and what messages you're trying to get out there.
Cool. Yeah. Well, this is what all the stuff we've been talking about today. This is the model of consent education that we've developed together over the past couple of years. And we keep finding that people are really hungry for this approach and this information. And, just treating consent with sex positive and desire focused and
with nuance,
gray areas, nuance, and and nonverbal communication, all this stuff, right? People are desperate for it, and so we keep being asked to give workshops in various places, and so we've developed this organization. It's a worker co-op called Consent Beyond Yes, and it's just the two of us so far, but we're going around to colleges and universities and communities, fraternities and sororities, sports teams, high schools, anyone who wants to bring us to their community to help teach this material, to help people practice, and we would love to come and help with that.
Yeah, and we also offer consultation, coaching, both for institutions who have policies around this, or who have existing education, and then like to incorporate more of these ideas. We can offer consultation around how to do that, or offer sort of a train the trainer thing where we give them more of our teaching notes and more of the pedagogy behind it. But also coaching for individuals or couples who want to improve their communication or who feel really left behind by the Me Too movement. The expectations around consent are changing really fast.
Yeah.
And often the people who are confused by it are kind of getting shut down and left behind. So we're also really excited to work with folks who want to understand and who, again, feel like they're being left behind, but realize that there's something going on here that I'm not quite getting, and I need some help catching up to the culture change. So we can offer individual coaching around that too.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
or if there's a community where a consent violation has happened, and they need help processing that, we're happy to help with that as well.
Right. Yeah, I have some experience with mediation of those kinds of conversations, as well as just presentations. If you're not looking for the interactive workshop, but more of an informational presentation, we can do that.
Sure. As well. Perfect. That's wonderful. So the last question I always ask any person I interview is, was there anything I didn't ask that you were hoping I would, or anything that I didn't get to that you were hoping to cover today?
Anything?
That I can think of. I think we got to it all.
Yeah, I think I would just add that we didn't really talk about like the neuroscience part and the research behind this very much, but there is a lot there. I wrote my master's paper, my capstone for my master's degree, on embodied consent, really using a body psychotherapy approach to understand consent through that lens. So, there's so much stuff around the dual control model of sexual response, and, what are our exciters and inhibitors of sexual response. And you alluded to this a little bit, that those aren't always things that we choose, but they are things that we can work with to promote sexual enjoyment. Getting into polyvagal theory and how well we're able to cooperate and collaborate versus feeling like we're opponents. Really, like there's so much neuroscience behind reasons that orienting toward desire, having these relaxed body states, engaging with people as teammates really just changes so much in our system in ways that is so much better for relationships.
And as a rewiring of sorts is what you're getting at. Mm-hmm.
It absolutely is. And we know that we have a high level of plasticity in our brains, and however old we are, we can learn new things. We can rewire our brains. Even better if we can start wiring our kids' brains for this to begin with. But it can have a huge impact on relationships. So as much as we're focused on sex and the conversation about consent is centered on sex, this is really about relationships in general and about how we live. Do we approach the world from a self and other, us versus them kind of thing? Do we approach the world from a lens of what I'm afraid of? Or do I approach the world from a sense of what can I create and who's here for me to work with? And, in my relationships, how do I approach with trust? Even in non-romantic, non-sexual relationships, how do I approach with trust and communication as opposed to fear of rejection or whatever else gets in the way of connection? This work is really about promoting connection and just promoting doing what we love.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I've been spending time here with Emma Dayley and Fuzzie Connor, founders of Consent Beyond Yes, which you can find at consentbeyondyes.com, talking about collaborative consent, a new model that really, I think, brings together a lot of the concerns that we've been having around consent in a way that is approachable and doable and focuses on desire and want and, like you said, sexy sex. So that's what I think we're all kind of rooting for. And I'm so pleased that you were able to share time with me today. I always appreciate time that I know is of your busy schedules and your energy and everything to share it with us and this audience. I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much for being with us.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having us, for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
You're very welcome. And for those of you who are listening, just please remember that this does not happen without your support. So please consider a donation at mormonsex.info is the new website that we've been organizing. And you can also subscribe to the Apple iTunes podcast station as well and listen to all the great interviews. I'm always so pleased with the level of people who are able to come on this show. So yeah, and let me know too your feedback. Let me know if there's a topic you want me to cover that I haven't covered yet. If you're enjoying the material and finding it valuable, or if you have some complaints along the way, I'm always willing to listen. So everybody take care. On to healthy and sexual happiness and ongoing experiences that help us along that journey. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you. An ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.